Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The blinding midday sun over Rattlesnake Gulch was a hammer blow, flattening the already parched landscape into a canvas of merciless ochre and searing heat. Jebediah Jeb Stone, a man whose hands were as gnarled as ancient oak roots and whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, knelt in the simmering dust, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His best mule, a magnificent sturdy beast named Lucky, the very lifeline of his solitary existence, the animal that hauled his traps, carried his sparse supplies, and was his only connection to the distant trading post, stood patiently beside him. But Lucky was not the focus of Jeb's desperate attention. Instead, his gaze, usually as steady as a rifle sight, was locked on two small, trembling figures huddled beside a meager mesquite bush. Two Apache sisters, barely older than saplings, their eyes wide with terror and their clothes torn from a frantic barefoot flight. Their names, whispered in a language Jeb barely understood, were Najoni, Beautiful, and Ayana, Eternal Blossom, names that felt terribly out of place in this brutal, unforgiving reality. One sister, Najoni, clutched a crudely fashioned wooden doll, her small fingers white-knuckled with fear, while Ayana, slightly older, tried to shield her, her thin body trembling. They were exhausted, parched, and most terrifyingly, clearly being hunted. Jeb had stumbled upon them by chance, following a faint game trail, only to find them near collapse, their small, broken footprints in the dust telling a story of relentless pursuit. His immediate instinct was to help, a deep, ingrained code of decency that often put him at odds with the prevalent prejudices of the frontier. But helping them meant sacrificing Lucky, his steadfast companion and sole means of survival in the brutal wilds. The conflict was sharp and immediate, his own solitary life for the lives of two children from a people his kind often fought against. The sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering mirage, amplifying the urgency. He knew, with a grim certainty, that to delay was to condemn them. The choice was not just about charity, it was about a primal, human response to absolute desperation. He could walk away, pretend he never saw them, and preserve his own fragile existence, or he could offer his last, best possession and condemn himself to a lonely, dangerous trek back to civilization on foot. This was the emotionally shocking moment, the silent humiliation of knowing his own survival was a direct counterpoint to their freedom. His gaze swept the horizon, a seasoned trapper's instinct honed by decades in the wilderness. He saw it, a faint, almost invisible plume of dust on the distant horizon, moving with a speed that spoke of riders hard and fast. Their pursuers were close, too close. There was no time for hesitation, no time for regret. The pattern break was instant, from observer to desperate savior. Jeb knew the route, a treacherous, rarely used path through a narrow canyon that would lead the girls to the safety of the southern Apache territories. A path too rough for horses, but perfectly suited for Lucky's sure-footed agility. He looked at Lucky, whose large, intelligent eyes seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, the unspoken farewell. The mule had been with him for 10 years, through blizzards, droughts, and loneliness, a silent, loyal friend. Giving him up was like severing a limb, but the sight of Najoni's trembling hands clutching her doll solidified his resolve. He would walk, he would starve, he would face the desert alone, but these children would live. The raw, emotional hook of the scene was the immediate, heart-wrenching understanding of this profound, unspoken sacrifice. With movements that were both practiced and painful, Jeb quickly began to transfer the small, vital provisions from Lucky's saddlebags. He kept only his rifle, a small canteen, and a pouch of dried jerky, enough for a few days at best. The rest, he carefully packed into two small worn leather bags that he slung over Lucky's back, securing them tightly. He included his own personal treasure, a small tarnished silver compass, a gift from his long-dead mother, a symbol of guidance and hope. "This will show you the sun, little ones," he mumbled, his voice rough with emotion, placing it gently into Najoni's bag. He then turned to the girls, his weathered face softened by a desperate urgency. He pointed to Lucky, then to the distant southern mountains, using simple, clear gestures. "Go, fast, south, do not stop." He then pointed to himself, then to the dust cloud, a grim warning. "I will distract them. You must run." This was the "wait, what?" moment. A lone trapper, despised by many, now offering his life and livelihood for strangers. He helped the girls onto Lucky's back, their small bodies barely weighing the sturdy mule down. Ayana, the older sister, looked at him, her eyes filled with a raw, unspoken gratitude, a silent promise. Jeb slapped Lucky's flank with a heavy, final thud. "Go, boy! Go!" Lucky hesitated for a moment, looking back at Jeb with those intelligent, understanding eyes, before finally turning and cantering down the hidden path, his hooves kicking up a plume of dust that quickly mingled with the larger, more menacing cloud on the horizon. Jeb watched them go, his heart a raw, exposed nerve. The mule, his last tether to civilization, was gone. He was alone, utterly alone, with nothing but his rifle and a dwindling canteen. He turned, facing the approaching dust cloud, his body a stark silhouette against the relentless sun. The pursuers were a dark, growing stain on the horizon, moving with terrifying speed. He had given up his best mule so the Apache sisters could escape. Now, all that remained was the agonizing wait. Their father, he knew, would arrive before sunset. But whose father? The girl's father, or the leader of the vengeful group now bearing down on him? The cliffhanger was palpable, a chilling echo in the simmering air. Jebediah, Jeb, stoned, did not wait for the riders. Instead, he plunged into the nearest dry wash, a shallow winding ravine filled with sun-baked gravel and sharp shadows. He moved with the calculated cunning of a fox, deliberately leaving a confusing trail that led away from the narrow canyon path Lucky and the girls had taken. His body, stiff and protesting from decades of hard living, moved with a sudden, desperate agility, spurred by the terrifying urgency of the growing dust cloud. He knew this land, its deceptive dips and rises, better than any man, a solitary knowledge that was now his only weapon. As he scrambled over a low ridge, he paused, his gaze fixed on the menacing, approaching figures. There were 3 of them, riding hard, their faces obscured by the distance and the dust, but their intent was clear and lethal. They were not settlers or lawmen, they were trackers, moving with the cold, focused precision of professional hunters. This shift in energy, from the soft sacrificial act of Chapter 1 to the hard, tense desperation of the chase, was immediate and chilling. Jeb's mind, racing with the rhythm of survival, flashed back to the humiliation that had driven him into this lonely existence. He had once been a respected man, a master trapper in the thriving community of Willow Creek, a town now consumed by the very greed and prejudice he was currently fighting. His internal struggle had begun 5 years ago when the town council, led by the vile, self-righteous Sheriff Claiborne, had instituted a harsh bounty system on all Apache activity within the territory, justifying it as protection. Jeb, who had always maintained a quiet, respectful neutrality with the Apache tribes, protested publicly, calling the bounty nothing more than legalized murder. He was ridiculed, accused of collaboration, and finally, financially ruined, when his trapping license was revoked. His greatest humiliation was the silent condemnation of his own peers, the people he had worked beside for 30 years. He had walked away from Willow Creek not out of defeat, but out of a stinging moral rejection of their cruelty, trading society for solitude. That betrayal, that deep-seated sense of having been morally wronged, was the core emotional driver for his reckless, sacrificial act today. The distant riders slowed, their horses snorting and tossing their heads as they struggled to follow Jeb's deliberately confusing tracks through the mixed terrain. Jeb used this brief lull to climb further up the bluff, finding a precarious hiding spot beneath an overhang of shale rock that offered both concealment and a commanding view. He wiped the sweat and gritty dust from his eyes, the taste of dry alkali coating his tongue, and watched the hunters. They fanned out, their movements disciplined, confirming his worst fear. They were skilled. He needed to make a larger, more obvious diversion. His eyes landed on a patch of dry, brittle sagebrush about 50 yards from his position, a perfect, volatile fuel source. The only way to save the sisters was to draw the hunter's eyes directly onto him and off the subtle trail Lucky was leaving. This realization brought with it a renewed surge of adrenaline and a frightening clarity. The chase had now become an intended confrontation. He pulled the last of the dry jerky from his pouch, chewing it quickly, forcing the sustenance into his starved body. He then retrieved his rifle and sighted down the barrel, not at the men, but at the patch of sagebrush. He knew the risk was immense. The sound of the gunshot would instantly pinpoint his location. But the need for a diversion outweighed the danger of exposure. He had to create a distraction so sharp, so urgent, that the hunters would forget the faint trail of a mule and two small girls. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he fired. The shot cracked through the heavy silence, a sharp, violent sound that instantly ignited the dry sage. A plume of black, oily smoke billowed upward, dark and undeniable against the blue sky, a beacon that screamed danger and pursuit, not far from their original location. The effect was instantaneous, and the wait, what? Moment of the chapter. The riders snapped their heads toward the smoke, their organized search instantly broken. Two of the figures spurred their horses toward the rising smoke, confirming they had taken the bait. But the third, a taller figure who rode with an unnerving authority, paused, his horse stock still. Instead of following the others, this man, clearly the leader, dismounted. He walked over to where the mule's original tracks split off, the point where Jeb had started his feint, and slowly, deliberately, knelt down. Jeb's blood ran cold. This man was not fooled by the distraction. He was studying the tracks, separating the noise from the signal, the tracks of the man from the tracks of the mule. The leader hadn't taken the bait. He had isolated the truth. Jeb's heart pounded with a terrifying realization. The leader was a master tracker, and the simple sacrifice of the mule had just initiated a deadly high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. The leader rose, his face still in shadow, and pointed directly toward Jeb's hidden location, a silent, damning command to his remaining companion. The escalation was terrifying. Two men were now closing in, and their leader knew exactly where Jeb was. Jeb scrambled deeper into the shallow crevice, the adrenaline masking the ache in his joints, his eyes frantically scanning the approaching terrain. The two remaining hunters, spurred by the silent command of their leader, began to close the distance, moving with a chilling, synchronized efficiency. The sun, now higher and hotter, made the air shimmer, making it difficult for Jeb to track their exact movements. But the heavy thud of their horses' hooves against the dry earth was a rapidly escalating drumbeat of doom. He could no longer rely on concealment. He needed to create chaos. He gripped his rifle tighter, its cool metal a small comfort against the heat. His mind, however, kept returning to the small silver compass he had tucked into Nijoni's bag, a token of guidance that now felt like a desperate plea for a distant mercy. This internal trigger, the thought of the children's safety, was the only thing preventing him from freezing under the immense pressure. The leader of the pursuit, a man whose face was still mostly obscured by a wide-brimmed black hat, halted his horse about 200 yards away, settling into a position that allowed him to command the entire bluff. He dismounted, pulling a long, heavy rifle from his scabbard, and began a slow, deliberate stalk toward Jeb's position. The second hunter, a younger man, circled around to Jeb's flank, cutting off any possibility of retreat back down the dry wash. Jeb was pinned, exposed, and outmatched. This was the sharp, intense scene of isolation and danger. He knew the rifle he held was his last, best chance, but he hesitated. A trapper's code was to kill only for sustenance or absolute self-defense, and firing now would invite a bloody, definitive end. He needed to find a way to escape this confrontation without bloodshed, to preserve the precious minutes Lucky and the girls were gaining. He recognized the deeper motive of the hunters. They wanted the girls back, not necessarily Jeb's life, unless he became a direct obstruction. Jeb shifted his weight, dislodging a small avalanche of shale that rattled down the slope, a mistake that instantly drew the leader's attention. The black-hatted man stopped, raised his rifle and spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the dry air, sharp and laced with an intimidating authority. "Give it up, old man. We know you helped them run. Tell us where the mule went, and we'll leave you to your miserable fate." The command was not a question, but a cold, hard promise. This was the moment of direct conflict, the demand for betrayal. Jeb remained silent, pressing himself flat against the rock, allowing the visual bait of his stillness to convey desperation rather than defiance. He noticed something crucial about the leader. The man's posture, his clothing, and the quality of his saddle all spoke of money and power, far beyond the means of a simple bounty hunter. This man was not hired help. He was directly invested in the capture of the sisters. Seeing his silence, the leader took another step, the sun catching the silver-inlaid butt of his rifle. "They are my responsibility. You interfere with what is mine," he roared, injecting a frightening personal possessiveness into the chase. The revelation added a terrifying layer to the escalation. The girls were being hunted not just by a cruel regime, but by a man who claimed ownership. This was the moment of raw, deep emotional revelation that complicated the entire situation. Jeb needed a diversion, and his eyes landed on a loose, heavy slab of rock, balanced precariously on the lip of the overhang above the circling hunter. With a sudden burst of desperate energy, he kicked out with his heel, sending the slab of rock tumbling down the slope toward the younger man. The noise was deafening, a terrifying cascade of stone. The circling hunter, startled, reacted instantly, pulling his horse back with a panicked jerk, losing his footing on the loose gravel. The surprise was the "wait, what?" moment of the chapter, buying Jeb a precious second. The distraction gave Jeb the opening he needed. He scrambled up and over the ridge, firing a single warning shot into the air, intentionally missing the men. He was now running on the open high plateau, a visible target, but running in the opposite direction from the mule's path. The final, absolute commitment to his sacrifice. The leader swore, a sound of pure, venomous frustration, and abandoned his rifle position, mounting his horse with an explosive energy. The leader knew where Jeb was, and more importantly, he knew that Jeb had bought the mule a massive lead. Jeb's deliberate exposure confirmed the hunter's suspicions. The old trapper was willing to die to protect the girls. The debt was now paid with the currency of his own freedom and safety, and the only question remaining was how long he could stay ahead of the inevitable capture. Jeb ran, his lungs burning with the effort, the sharp, dry air searing his throat with every gasping breath. The high, open plateau offered no cover, making him a dark, moving target against the blinding canvas of the mid-morning sky. He was moving toward a desolate stretch of low, scrubby pine forest, a deceptive area known for its tangled undergrowth and deep fissures. His primary goal was simple: reach the cover of the pines before the two riders, now closing in fast, could cut him off and turn the pursuit into a firing line. He ignored the searing pain in his calves and the frantic internal battle of regret over his immediate reckless action. He had drawn them away, but he had exchanged a slow death by starvation for a quick, brutal end by lead. The emotional momentum was now driven purely by survival instinct, a desperate animal flight. He reached the edge of the pines and plunged into the dense thicket, the low-hanging branches whipping his face. The scent of pine needles a sharp, welcome change from the dust. He knew the younger hunter, now circling back with renewed fervor, was less than a minute behind him. He needed to disappear completely. He spotted a deep, narrow fissure in the earth, barely visible beneath a curtain of thick yellow grass. a natural hiding place carved out by ancient flash floods. He dove into the fissure, pulling the heavy grass over his head, settling into the cool, damp earth below. He lay utterly still, his breathing ragged and loud in the confined space, the earth pressed against his cheek, tasting of cold mineral and damp soil. The sudden shift in rhythm, from frantic open sprint to absolute terrifying stillness, was a crucial survival technique, a necessary pattern break to confuse the hunters. The sound of the horse's hooves was suddenly deafening, the animals snorting and stamping mere feet from his hidden location. He could hear the low, venomous voices of the two hunters as they halted, their frustration palpable. The leader, the man in the black hat, dismounted again. "He's here!" The voice was low, authoritative and chillingly close. "The tracks go in, but they don't come out. He's hiding like the old rat he is." The younger man, fueled by rage, began to lash out, kicking the underbrush and shouting curses. Jeb lay motionless, willing his heart to slow, the cold steel of his rifle pressed against his palm, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He could feel the heavy weight of their presence, the tension so thick it felt like a physical pressure on his chest. The leader spoke again, this time with a chilling, calculated calm that was far more terrifying than the young man's rage. "He gave up the mule, Jed. He knows the mule is faster. He's trying to buy time." He then delivered the chilling, "Wait, what?" moment of the chapter, a stunning reveal of motive and connection. "This isn't about the bounty, old man. The girls, they are my family, my daughters, and you have stolen them from my duty. Show yourself." The world tilted for Jeb. The powerful, terrifying pursuer was not the girl's captor, but their father. Jeb had assumed the hunters were working for Sheriff Claiborne or some other vengeful white authority. The girl's fear had been so profound, so absolute, that Jeb had never questioned who they were fleeing from. The truth, that he had stolen the daughters from their father, a man powerful enough to command a posse, was a crushing, terrifying reversal of his moral sacrifice. The guilt of this unintended betrayal was an immediate, powerful internal trigger. The leader, whose name Jeb now realized was likely Jed, spoke again, his voice cracking with a raw, agonizing desperation that was undeniably paternal. "I only want them back, safe. They ran because I made a mistake. I lost their mother. Don't make me lose them too, old fool. The mule won't save them from what's coming." The sudden, overwhelming surge of deep emotion, grief, fear, and profound parental love was the deepest motive of the chase, revealed at the worst possible moment. Jeb was caught in an impossible moral trap. He had saved the children from a terrifying situation, only to deliver them into the hands of a man who was clearly suffering. He now knew, with certainty, that his death would not be an act of heroism, but an agonizing failure that deprived a father of his daughters. The sound of the younger man drawing his knife, beginning to systematically slash through the concealing grass, brought Jeb brutally back to the present. The cold tip of the blade was getting closer, moving inexorably toward his head. He had to move, and he had to move now, with the chilling knowledge that he was not running from evil, but from desperate, misplaced love. The younger hunter's knife sliced through the thick grass barely an inch from Jeb's ear, the rasping sound an immediate terrifying threat. Jeb knew he was out of time. He didn't fire his rifle. Instead, with a burst of frantic energy fueled by the shocking revelation of Jed's paternity, he rolled violently out of the fissure, scrambling backward into the dense pine thicket. He crashed through the dry branches, creating a loud, chaotic noise that instantly drew both hunters toward him. He wanted them to pursue him directly, to continue their belief that he was the only problem, ensuring they remained focused away from the mule's faint trail. This was the sharp, intense scene of pure, desperate flight, the immediate escalation following the emotional reveal. The cost of his ignorance was now the life of the children's father, or his own. Jeb burst into a small clearing, his shirt snagging on a thorn bush, leaving a dark, small tear. He stopped abruptly, turning to face his pursuers, his rifle raised and aimed at the ground between them. He ignored the younger, angrier man, focusing instead on Jed, the father, whose face was now visible, a mask of dust, sweat, and profound, gut-wrenching grief. Jed was a powerful man, his clothes finer than a common rancher's, his posture suggesting a former leader, now tragically broken. His eyes, dark and haunted, were fixed on Jeb with an intensity that spoke not of bloodlust, but of absolute despair. "They are running because they are terrified," Jeb shouted, his voice cracking from thirst and fear, but carrying a sharp ring of moral certainty. "What did you do, man? What mistake did you make that drives your own daughters to flee into the desert?" The confrontation was a massive escalation, a shift from a physical chase to a brutal, emotional interrogation. Jed lowered his rifle slightly, momentarily stunned by the raw accusation. The younger hunter, however, used the pause to circle wide, aiming to flank Jeb. Jeb knew he couldn't hold them both. He took a calculated risk. He threw his remaining pouch of jerky and his almost empty canteen hard into the face of the circling hunter. A brief, chaotic distraction. As the younger man staggered, Jed, the father, lunged forward, tackling Jeb to the ground with a powerful surge of strength. They crashed together, the air instantly filled with the dry scent of pine needles, dust, and raw sweat. The rifles skidded away, useless for the moment. The fight was sudden, brutal, and visceral, a tangle of desperate limbs and choked curses. This was not a fight of enemies, but a desperate physical struggle between two men who believed they were protecting the same children. Jeb was older, but Jed was fueled by the frantic, terrible energy of a parent facing the loss of his family. Jed pinned Jeb down, his knee crushing Jeb's chest, forcing the air out of his lungs. "They ran because of the sickness. The fever took their mother. The elders blame me." Jed spat out the words, raw with shame and pain, the terrible secret revealing itself in a desperate torrent. "I was drinking to forget. They saw me when I shouldn't have been seen. They thought I was going to abandon them too." This deep motive, shame, guilt, and the fear of abandonment was the heavy emotional wound of the chapter. The "wait, what?" moment solidified. The girls weren't fleeing from a monster, but from a broken father whose grief had made him appear monstrous. Jeb's act of saving them had been an act of unintended cruelty, prolonging the terror for both the girls and their father. The crushing guilt gave Jeb a sudden, terrifying burst of clarity and purpose. He stopped struggling against Jed, his body going momentarily limp, the submission a deliberate tactical move. "They're on a mule. Lucky. They're heading for the southern mountains, the old Apache trail. Go, now," Jeb gasped, forcing the words out around the crushing weight on his chest, sacrificing his safety entirely to ensure Jed understood the escape route. The shock of the confession, the revelation of the mule, and the precise direction stunned Jed into stillness. He looked down at the defeated trapper, his face a complex mixture of relief, confusion, and suspicion. The younger hunter, now recovered, rushed forward, knife raised, ready to end the old man. But Jed, his eyes fixed on the distant southern horizon, lifted his hand, halting the attack. The father's priority was not revenge, but retrieval. He had the truth. He had the direction. He had to go. Jed rose slowly, the raw paternal desperation overriding his rage. He stared at Jeb one last time, an unreadable intensity in his dark eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the debt and a threat of future retribution. He retrieved his rifle and his horse, sparing only one final cold command to the younger hunter. "Find his mule tracks. Secure the mule. Leave the old man alive but broken. We go after the girls." With that, Jed mounted his horse and galloped away, a figure of speed and tragic urgency, disappearing into the glare of the desert sun. Jeb lay on the ground, bruised and aching, watching the dust trail shrink. He had given up his mule and his freedom. He had saved the girls from one fear, only to expose them to the anguish of their father's pursuit. The escalation was critical. The sisters were now racing their grieving father toward an unknown destination, and the tension was about to break. Jeb lay in the dusty clearing, the imprint of Jed's knee still aching on his chest. He was alone, abandoned by the hunters who now had a clear objective: follow the fastest trail south. The younger hunter, having secured his horse and retrieved his knife, stood over Jeb, a sneer twisting his features. His name, Jeb finally heard him utter to himself in a low curse, was Rance. Rance did not move to tie Jeb, nor did he raise his rifle. His instructions were clear: leave him broken but alive. The humiliation was profound. Jeb was considered so insignificant, so defeated, that he wasn't even worth killing. He had become a non-entity in the chase, his fate sealed by his own act of sacrifice. This sharp psychological wound was the new, heavy emotional beat of the chapter. Jeb pushed himself up, his body protesting every movement, the sensory language of the sharp pain and the dry, bitter taste of dust dominating his focus. Rance, meanwhile, began the meticulous work of backtracking, searching for Lucky's tracks. He was not a tracker of Jed's caliber, but he was systematic and fueled by a slow, simmering resentment. Jeb watched him, realizing Rance was the key to their entire operation. Rance was the muscle, the hired gun who likely facilitated the escape from Willow Creek, or wherever Jed currently resided. His presence meant Jed had money and connections. As Rance scoured the dry wash, he dropped something small and metallic: a silver pocket watch, tarnished but expensive, an object out of place for a common hunter. Jeb recognized the intricate engraving instantly. It was a symbol associated with Sheriff Claiborne's faction in Willow Creek, a signet of the council. This was the sudden, shocking reveal. Jed, the Apache father, wasn't just grieving. He was allied with, or perhaps even employed by, the very men who oppressed his people. The implication was staggering, a terrifying twist that complicated the entire moral landscape of Jeb's actions. Jed was not merely a heartbroken father. He was a man caught between two worlds, perhaps working for the bounty hunters who wanted his people exterminated, using his position to secure the safety of his daughters, or maybe, worse, a captive force to chase them down. The sisters' initial absolute terror now made perfect, sickening sense. They weren't just fleeing a drunken father. They were fleeing a father who might be forced to deliver them into the hands of their enemies. Jeb's act of saving them might be the only true protection they had. This realization spurred Jeb from his defeat, igniting a fierce, protective rage, an internal trigger that demanded immediate action. He feigned a collapse, clutching his chest and coughing violently, drawing Rance's attention. As Rance turned, annoyed by the distraction, Jeb seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, not for Rance's gun, but for the pocket watch lying glinting on the ground. Rance roared, realizing the old man was still a threat, and lunged after him. Jeb scooped up the watch and, with a final burst of desperate old man strength, hurled himself back into the thickest part of the pine scrub, disappearing instantly. Rance fired a shot wildly into the bushes, the sound deafening and sharp, but he couldn't see the target. He had his orders, and he wouldn't risk leaving his post to track the wounded old man. He had to secure the mule. Jeb, now hidden but clutching the silver watch, a piece of incriminating evidence and a powerful story thread, knew his mission had shifted. He was no longer just protecting the girls. He was seeking the truth about their father and the powerful men who were exploiting him. But the sun was beginning its terrifying descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and blood red. The shadow cast by the setting sun meant time was running out, and the most frightening part of the title was rapidly approaching. Their father arrived before sunset. Jeb had to get to the southern mountains, not to save the girls from Jed, but to warn them of the complex, deadly trap their father might represent, or to help Jed himself if he was a prisoner of the council. The destination was clear, but the journey was impossible. He was wounded, exhausted, and miles from the trail. He started walking south, ignoring the protest of his body, the setting sun a visual countdown clock. He knew the girls, riding Lucky, would likely be nearing the treacherous final pass into the Southern Territory. Jeb had to find a shortcut, an impossible route that would cut off the superior speed of Jed's horse. He needed the mule's sure-footed path. He had to pray that the very mule he sacrificed would leave enough of a trail for him to follow, even in the fading light. The final crushing thought was the escalation of the stakes. If Jed caught them, he wouldn't be turning them over to safety. He would be turning them over to Willow Creek. The weight of this new knowledge was now heavier than the rifle in his hand. Jeb walked, and the world grew cold and hostile around him. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the canyon into the blue, silent chill of twilight. He pushed his exhausted body through the gathering gloom, guided only by the faint indentations of the mule's tracks that occasionally appeared in patches of softer earth, tiny, perfect crescents that were the only proof of the girl's escape. The sound of a lone, distant coyote howl echoed through the canyon, a mournful cry that mirrored the emptiness in Jeb's own chest. His emotional quiet moment was spent in deep contemplation. The silver pocket watch, the key to the truth, cold and heavy in his hand. He realized the depth of Jed's entrapment, an Apache man, highly skilled, being used by his enemies, his own daughters becoming collateral in a deadly political game. The terrain became increasingly brutal as he neared the final approach to the southern mountains. The trail narrowed into a precarious goat path, twisting up the sheer face of a canyon wall, the same path he had intended for Lucky. This path was too dangerous for a man to navigate in the darkness, and yet it was his only chance to cut off Jed's speed. He knew Jed would have to take the slightly longer, easier route around the base of the canyon wall, giving Jeb a temporary advantage in elevation, if not distance. The sensory language was intense. He could hear the wind whistling sharply through the canyon gap, feeling the sharp, biting edge of the shale rock beneath his worn boots. He had to trust that Lucky's legendary sure-footedness had carried the girls safely through this deadly labyrinth. He started the treacherous climb, moving agonizingly slow, using every crack and crevice for purchase. Halfway up the vertical path, he stumbled upon the evidence he both dreaded and needed, a clear, fresh set of horseshoe prints, overlaid on the mule's tracks. Jed had already reached the canyon path. He was on the mule's trail, moving faster than Jeb had anticipated, his paternal desperation overriding any caution. The escalation was terrifying. Jed was minutes ahead, and the race was nearly over. This was the wait what moment that shattered Jeb's faint hope. He was too late to warn the girls. The sun was gone, and their father was close enough to touch. As he clung to the rock face, desperately scanning the dark trail ahead, he saw a flicker of movement, a small dark shape clinging to a rocky outcrop just above him. His heart stopped. He immediately raised his rifle, ready for a final desperate stand, assuming it was Jed waiting in ambush. But then, a quiet, almost soundless whisper drifted down on the wind. Ayana. It was the name of the older sister. Jeb slowly lowered his rifle, realizing the desperate truth. The girls were still ahead, and Ayana was acting as a rear guard, a tiny, courageous sentinel waiting for her sister and the mule to clear the final, most dangerous pass. Jeb spoke, his voice hoarse and low, careful not to startle her. "I am Jeb. I helped you. You must move. Your father is close." He tried to climb toward her, but Ayana shook her head violently, her eyes, barely visible in the faint starlight, fixed on a spot far below, around the canyon bend. "Not father," she whispered, her voice laced with a pure, chilling terror. "Others, with lights. They followed him." This was the core emotional shock. The girls were fleeing not just their father, but a larger, far more dangerous threat that was using Jed as a tracker. The true enemy, the men from Willow Creek perhaps, was closing in, using the sound of Jed's frantic pursuit as a distraction while they followed silently in the dark. Jed was caught between his daughters and his masters. Ayana then pointed down the path, her small finger trembling. "He is coming. He is coming for us. They made him promise." She confirmed Jeb's worst fears. Jed was under duress. Jeb looked down the path and saw it. a single powerful lantern beam swinging around the canyon bend below, followed by the muffled sound of a single horse laboring up the steep path. It was Jed. He was alone, but the fact that he was so close meant his time was up. Jed made a desperate choice. He climbed higher, ignoring Ayana's protests, until he was directly above the path. He would intercept Jed, not to fight him, but to warn him of the silent pursuers he hadn't seen. He had to turn the father into an ally, or sacrifice his life in a final futile gesture. The two figures, the grieving father and the beaten trapper, were about to collide in the darkness, with the silent witnesses of Willow Creek closing in. Jeb braced himself against the cold, unforgiving rock, peering down at the lantern light bobbing rapidly up the narrow path. The light illuminated the figure of Jed, the father, riding not with the speed of a hunter, but with the frantic, exhausted urgency of a man running out of time. He was alone, his eyes wide and fixed only on the small, fragile prize ahead, his daughters. He was oblivious to the subtle, dark shapes that Jeb knew were following his light, the true bounty hunters, moving like shadows, closing the trap. The emotional rhythm was a brutal mix of fear and intense strategic necessity. Jeb had to convince this broken, terrified father that he was not the enemy, that the real threat lay behind them, and he had to do it in the precious seconds before the silent pursuers reached their position. As Jed's horse reached the tight bend directly beneath him, Jeb acted. He dropped the silver pocket watch with the telltale engraving, letting it clatter loudly on the rock just ahead of Jed's horse. The sharp metallic sound, so foreign in the wilderness, caused the horse to rear violently, whinnying in panic. Jed, momentarily distracted and thrown off balance, pulled his horse to a sudden, wrenching halt. He looked down at the ground, his lantern light catching the unmistakable glint of the silver watch. His face, illuminated by the orange glow, contorted in a terrifying mix of recognition and dread. He knew the engraving. He knew what that watch represented: the authority, the ownership, the betrayal of Willow Creek. Jeb seized the moment. He spoke in a loud, clear whisper, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, carrying the absolute authority of truth. Jed, they are behind you. The men who own that watch. They followed your light. They made you hunt your daughters, but they're here to take them back. I saved them from your grief. Now save them from their greed. The accusation was a massive escalation, a direct challenge to Jed's loyalty and his shame. Jed stared up into the darkness where Jeb's voice had originated, his mind reeling from the sudden, impossible confluence of fear, the evidence of the watch, and the desperate warning. This was the pinnacle, wait-a-what moment, the hunter realizing he was the bait. Before Jed could respond, the sound of hooves clattering on the path below them confirmed Jeb's warning. Two riders, dark silhouettes without a lantern, moving silently, swept around the lower bend. They were the true hunters, the men Rance was likely reporting to. They saw Jed halted, confused, staring up into the dark canyon wall. Jed, secure the girls, one of the riders barked, their voice low and professional. They've gone too far. We need them alive. The command exposed the entire plot. The girls were a valuable commodity, and Jed was merely the tool used to track them down. Jed made his choice in a blinding, instantaneous flash of paternal love and bitter self-loathing. He realized the trapper was telling the truth. He looked up at the dark, unseen source of the voice, his heart tearing with the pain of his betrayal. He fired his rifle, not at Jeb, but at the rock face high above the approaching bounty hunters. The shot echoed deafeningly, triggering a small, carefully aimed landslide of loose shale and rock onto the path below. The explosion of sound and debris caused the bounty hunters' horses to panic, slowing their ascent and forcing them to scatter, breaking their silent, deadly approach. "Go, Jeb!" Jed screamed, his voice thick with raw emotion, now an ally, not an enemy. "Take my horse. Follow the path. They are almost clear. I owe you. Go." He dismounted quickly, deliberately smashing his own lantern against the rock, plunging the entire path into utter darkness an act of self-sacrifice and pure chaos. The escalation was complete. Jed had switched sides, becoming the ultimate obstacle to his former masters. Jeb, guided by Ayana's desperate movements from the ledge above, saw his chance. He scrambled down, landing hard beside Jed's panicked horse. He mounted quickly, grabbing the reins. He gave one final desperate look at Jed, who had melted back into the shadows to face the enraged bounty hunters alone. The debt had shifted, and the father was now paying his own terrible price. Jeb spurred Jed's horse forward, an animal far superior to Lucky, but one that struggled to navigate the perilous, narrow trail in the pitch black. The moment he passed Ayana, he scooped her up onto the saddle, pulling her small, cold body against his chest. "We go now, Ayana. Where is your sister?" he shouted over the frantic breathing of the horse. Ayana, clutching him tightly, pointed toward the final narrow gap in the canyon wall that led down to the southern plateaus, the border of the Apache territory. The fear was still in her eyes, but now mingled with the fierce relief of a child finally seeing the light. Behind them, the sounds of the struggle began, shouts, curses, and the terrible metallic clash of a desperate fight breaking out on the dark path below. Jed was facing the full wrath of the bounty hunters alone, buying his daughters the impossible seconds they needed. Jeb's internal state was a torrent of adrenaline and sorrow. He was riding on a wave of pure redemptive power, the knowledge of the father's sacrifice now fueling his final push. He had the physical speed of the bounty hunter's horse, but the absolute need for caution. He slowed as they entered the final pass, a narrow, treacherous chute of rock that dropped steeply into the lower valley. And there, just ahead, illuminated by the sudden break in the terrain, was Lucky. The sturdy mule, moving with its characteristic steady, unhurried precision, was carrying Nijoni safely down the final sheer drop, the small girl clinging to the saddle horn, her wooden doll clutched in her hand. The visual was breathtaking. The mule, the symbol of Jeb's sacrifice, was delivering the child to safety, fulfilling its purpose with quiet dignity. As they reached Lucky, Jeb stopped his horse, dismounted, and quickly transferred Ayana to the mule. He looked at Nijoni, the small girl whose absolute terror had initiated this impossible debt. He pulled the tarnished silver compass from his pocket and placed it firmly in Nijoni's hand, closing her fingers around it. "South," he instructed, his voice low and firm. "Go until you see the river. Don't look back." The repeated phrase, the symbol of guidance, was the emotional resonance of the scene. The girls were safe, the sacrifice complete. The time for escape was over. The time for settling the score was now. He turned his horse back toward the canyon gap, leaving the girls and the mule to continue their descent. He rode only a short distance, stopping at the crest of the final pass, waiting. The fighting sounds below were growing faint, replaced by the grim sound of a single agonizing cry that echoed up the sheer rock face, a sound that spoke of a battle lost. Jeb knew Jed had fallen, but the sacrifice was not wasted. He saw the flicker of 2 lanterns rounding the bend. The bounty hunters, now free of Jed, racing toward the final prize. They were too late for the girls, but they would find the man who helped them. Jeb sat his horse, its silhouette massive and imposing against the dark mouth of the pass. He waited until the hunters' heads were clearly visible on the trail below, their faces contorted with rage and exhaustion. He didn't fire. Instead, he pulled the heavy, ceremonial bridle and saddle from Jed's horse, the finest horse in the canyon, a final ironic gesture. He then shouted one final word, a booming, echoing sound of contempt. "Go!" He slapped the horse hard on the flank, sending the magnificent animal galloping back down the canyon pass, stampeding directly over the narrow path where the bounty hunters were climbing. The resulting chaos was immediate and absolute. The unridden horse, terrified and riderless, slammed into the 2 hunters, causing a brutal, cascading fall of men, horses, and rock down the sheer canyon face. Jeb did not wait for the sound of their fall to end. He knew that the chaos would buy the girls the final, precious window of absolute safety. He turned and raced down the mule's trail, scrambling on foot, leaving the carnage and the sound of silence behind him. He had paid a mule, and in return he had sacrificed a horse, a man, and his own safety. He found the mule tracks and followed the only promise that mattered, the path to the river, the path to the girls. Jeb followed Lucky's steady, unmistakable tracks for a grueling hour, the moon now high and casting a weak silver light over the lower valley. He found the mule exactly where he knew it would be, standing patiently near a small, flowing stream, the river that marked the border of the Apache lands. The sisters, Nijoni and Ayana, were huddled together beside the mule, their fear finally receding, replaced by the quiet exhaustion of survivors. They were safe. The ordeal was over. Jeb approached them slowly, his body aching, his face bruised, the silver watch now discarded into the river current as a symbol of the fight's end. When the girls saw him, they didn't run. Instead, Ayana, the older sister, rose and walked toward him, her small body carrying the immense weight of gratitude. She didn't speak the words of thanks, but instead, she held up her hand, revealing the tarnished silver compass gleaming faintly in the moonlight, a symbol of the guidance he had provided. This was the powerful, silent acknowledgement of the debt paid, the raw, emotional resolution that needed no words. Jeb knelt before them, the dry earth cold beneath his knees. "Go now," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You are free. Your father—" He trailed off, unable to speak the terrible truth of Jed's final sacrifice. But Ayana simply nodded, her eyes showing a profound understanding. "He made his debt clean," she whispered back, using a phrase that translated perfectly. The father had redeemed his shame. The ultimate debt was paid by the ultimate sacrifice. They now understood the complexity of the love and betrayal they had fled from. He helped the girls back onto Lucky's back. This time, there was no fear, only quiet dignity. He slapped Lucky's flank one final time. The mule, turning toward the vast, dark territory of its people, disappeared into the night, carrying the two sisters to their safety. Jeb stood alone, watching until the last sound of the mule's hooves faded, the silence of the desert washing over him like an absolution. He had given up his best mule so the Apache sisters could escape. He had risked his life, learned a terrible secret, and been instrumental in the tragic end of their broken father. He started walking in the opposite direction, toward the vague promise of a future that held neither the mule nor the fear of Willow Creek. He was broke, alone and injured, but he was whole. He had acted out of a profound moral conviction, and the debt was paid in full. He was no longer the humiliated trapper of Willow Creek, but a man who had chosen compassion over cruelty, survival over prejudice. The sun was gone, the father had arrived before sunset, and the debt of the mule had secured the lives of his daughters forever.